Sloane Mercer asked a stranger for a kiss. That night, her boyfriend of 2 years was in the club's VIP bathroom with 2 women and a champagne flute. Without a tear, without a scream, without giving him the satisfaction of seeing the damage, she turned to the first man she found at the bar, tall, quiet, with the look of someone who'd never been caught off guard by anything, and whispered, "Pretend you know me, just 10 seconds. He didn't ask why. He put his hand on her face, tilted his head slowly, too slow to be fake, and kissed her in the middle of that bar like time had stopped just for them, deep, deliberate, the way her boyfriend had never kissed her in 2 whole years. When he pulled away, Sloane still hadn't caught her breath. Behind her, her boyfriend stood there with his jaw dropped. She didn't look back. The man looked at her with a devastating calm and said, 8 seconds. But it worked. What Sloane didn't know yet was that those 8 seconds had started a war. Neither of them had a plan to win. Chapter 1. The Wrong Kiss in the Right Place. The VIP bathroom door at Noir swung open, and what I found on the other side destroyed 2 years of my life in less than 3 seconds. Mateo was there, his dress shirt slightly open at the collar, and the smile of someone who had absolutely no rush, and there were 2 women with him. Not one, 2. One sitting on the white marble counter, and the other leaning against the mirror with a champagne flute in her hand, and her shoulder exposed in a way that left no doubt about what was happening in there. I stood still. I didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't do any of the things I'd imagined I would if this happened. When I reached 10, I turned and walked out without saying a word. The hallway was dark in that calculated way only expensive places manage, with that warm amber light spilling across the carpet and making everything a little more unreal than it already was. The music from downstairs rose in layers, the bass first, then the melody, then the murmur of 300 people who didn't know my name and were very lucky for it. I walked aimlessly for about 10 steps before nearly tripping over Bex, my best friend for 7 years, tattoo artist with me since the studio started, and the only person in New York with emotional radar sharp enough to find me in a dark hallway before I asked, who appeared around the corner as if she'd been summoned. She looked at me, looked behind me, at the closed VIP bathroom door, and then back at my face with that speed only she has, the ability to assess the magnitude of a disaster without needing verbal context. Bex opened her mouth and said the most useless thing anyone can say to another person in a moment like this. "Breathe," she said. "I am breathing," I answered, and headed toward the bar. The bar at Noir was long and black marble with gold veins, lit from underneath in a way that made any drink look more sophisticated than it was. I leaned against the counter and ordered a drink I knew I couldn't afford, because when everything falls apart at once, you commit at least one extra mistake in solidarity with your own chaos. And then I turned too quickly, and my elbow met the arm of someone who was standing right there beside me. The man was tall in a way that takes up space without trying, in a dark suit with a precise cut and dark hair, and he was holding a glass of whiskey with the calm of someone who'd never been caught off guard by anything in his life. His eyes found mine, dark, unmoving, and I opened my mouth to apologize, but the word didn't come out because there was something in the way he looked at me that made it hard to produce functional language. "Sorry," I said. Finally, he tilted his head slightly and said nothing, just kept looking at me with that expression of absolute serenity, like I was a detail in a puzzle he was already putting together before I arrived. I went to grab my drink. He stayed in the same place. "Sloane," Mateo's voice came from behind, deep and with that accent he always disguised at social events, and that now sounded like just one more thing that was fake about him. I felt the heat of his body approaching, and the smell of the same cologne that was mixed with the champagne from the bathroom, and something in my brain made a decision before I could intervene. I turned to the man beside me. He was still there, still holding the whiskey, still had that look of someone who'd seen enough and was waiting to see what I was going to do with it. I leaned slightly toward him and spoke low enough that only he could hear, but urgent enough that it was clear the time was real. "Please," I said, "pretend you know me, just 10 seconds. The man looked at me, then looked over my shoulder, at Mateo, no doubt. By the way, something in his expression changed almost imperceptibly, like a current of air you feel but don't see. Then the dark eyes came back to me, and he took maybe 2 seconds to decide, and then he put his glass on the counter and his hand on the side of my face and kissed me. I need to be honest. It wasn't a fake little kiss. His hand was firm and warm against my face, and the other went to rest on the counter behind me, with a calm that contrasted with the fact that the floor was slightly tilted under my feet. He kissed me slowly, with intention, the way people kiss when they're in no hurry at all, and want every second to be felt like a statement. And for 4 whole seconds I forgot the champagne, the VIP bathroom, the red dress I'd put on to make a romantic surprise, and my own last name. When he pulled away, the space between us existed again, but it was a different space than before, smaller, more charged, with the heat that lingers after something that shouldn't have happened and happened anyway. His eyes were on me, dark, and with that different layer I couldn't name, but also couldn't ignore. Behind me, silence. I looked over my shoulder. Matteo stood there with his jaw dropped, the excuse dead halfway between his brain and his mouth, with that expression of someone who's not processing what they're seeing. Then his expression closed, his eyes narrowed, and he left without saying anything, which was, in itself, a statement. The man beside me waited for Matteo to disappear into the crowd, and then looked at me again, with a corner of a smile so discreet I almost didn't notice it. 8 seconds, he said, his voice deep and low. But it worked. I went to the bathroom with Bex, who grabbed me by the arm as soon as we turned the corner of the hallway, and pulled me close with that energy of someone who has 10 questions and doesn't know which one to start with. "Who is that man?" Bex asked, her eyes wide, and her voice a tone higher than the situation called for. "Sloane, who is that man?" "I don't know," I said, and it was the simplest and most disturbing truth I had to offer. On the other side of the club, the man in the dark suit slowly turned his whiskey glass between his fingers, while another man approached from the side. Soren Vale, older by about 15 years, closed face and the posture of someone who for a decade had carried the hardest information with the weight of someone who knows exactly what it costs, and chose to stay standing on the same side anyway. "Do you know who that man is?" Soren said, low, his eyes in the direction Matteo had disappeared, the one who was with her. The man in the dark suit didn't turn his head immediately. When he did, there was something different in his eyes, not surprise, which evidently didn't exist in that face's expressive vocabulary, but rather the kind of cold recognition that precedes a decision. "Matteo Varga," he said. The second man was quiet for a moment, measuring the reaction. "Want me to monitor him? Keep an eye on him," the first one answered. And then he did something that clearly surprised the second. He didn't leave. He stayed in the same place, with his whiskey glass and his gaze fixed on the hallway where I had disappeared. His name was Cale Rienzo, and I still didn't know what that last name meant. Chapter 2. The Charade. No one should take seriously. Outside Noir, the Manhattan sidewalk was cold and wet with fine drizzle, and the line outside the club was long enough to remind me there was a whole world functioning while mine was falling apart. Bex was beside me holding both coats, hers and mine, with that expression of someone who still has 10 questions in the queue, but understood that the moment doesn't call for answers, it calls for presence. The man in the dark suit was 2 steps behind us, and I hadn't invited him. He simply came, with that silent naturalness that disturbed me more than it should. Then Matteo appeared. He came out the side door with long strides and the expression of someone who rehearsed what he's going to say in the elevator, and when he saw me standing on the sidewalk next to the man who had just kissed me in front of him, something in Matteo's face slipped. The control, the confidence, the whole performance, for exactly half a second, before he pulled it all back together and took 2 more steps in my direction. "Sloane," Matteo said, his voice calibrated to the tone of someone apologizing without apologizing. "I need to explain what you saw." And then it happened again. The same short circuit from the bar, the same decision made before I was aware I was making it. I turned to the man beside me, and he was already looking at me, as if he'd been waiting for exactly this, and I spoke low, fast, without being sure the proposition made any sense outside my head. "Would you be willing to pretend you're with me?" I whispered. "A month, just until he understands it's over." The man was quiet for about 3 seconds. 3 seconds I spent holding my breath and resisting the impulse to say, "Forget it, that was a horrible idea." And then he put his hand on my waist. Firm, warm, with a naturalness that suggested his hand had memory of the place, which was impossible, but my nervous system wasn't in any condition to process impossibilities right then. "All right," he said. Just that. Matteo took another step. The man beside me didn't move, didn't speak, didn't do absolutely anything except look at Matteo with that calm of someone who has all the time in the world and no problem with what's in front of him, and it was enough. I saw the exact moment Matteo backed down. It wasn't his body that backed down first. It was something in his eyes, an involuntary recognition he clearly didn't want to have. He looked at the man beside me for 2 long seconds, opened his mouth, closed it, and left. Bex looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher and said, very low, almost in my ear, "Sloane, I don't know who this man is, but you're going to explain everything to me in the car, word for word." Cale's car pulled up to the curb with a driver and an open door. Bex stared at me for 5 seconds with her eyebrow at the maximum height of her face, got in a taxi, and then I found myself sitting on the dark leather seat next to a man whose last name I still didn't know. The car's interior was silent in the way expensive silence knows how to be. No squeaks, no engine noise, no sound of the city coming from outside. The lights of Manhattan passed by the window in orange and white streaks, and I looked at them for a while as I tried to organize my thoughts into a sequence that made any sense. "What's your full name?" I asked, without taking my eyes off the window. "Cale," he answered. I waited. He didn't continue. So I turned to him, and he was looking at me with that corner of a smile I was already starting to recognize. Discreet, sharp, slightly satisfied with the situation. "And the last name?" I said. "Cale is enough for now," he answered, and the way he said it wasn't evasive. It was just a statement, like someone saying, "It's going to rain today," and isn't open to counter-arguments. I sighed and went back to the window. "That was crazy," I said. "It was," he agreed, without any sign of regret. "I don't usually ask strangers to kiss me in bars." "I know," he said, "and I don't usually kiss." There was no irony in the tone, no judgment. It was just a fact, delivered with the same serenity he did everything with. And for some reason that disturbed me more than anything he could have said with the intention of disturbing me. The car stopped in front of my building in the Lower East Side, which was strange because I hadn't given the address. I opened my mouth to ask, and Cale spoke first, his eyes on the street outside. "The man you left at the club," he said. "Be careful with him." I laughed. It was a nervous laugh, the kind that comes out when your body doesn't know what to do with the seriousness of a sentence. "You don't even know him," I said. Cale looked at me, direct, without blinking, with that calm that made it impossible to know what was happening behind the dark eyes. "I know exactly who he is," he said. I kept looking at him for 3 seconds trying to understand what that meant, and didn't find anything that made sense within what I knew about the world. So I got out of the car, climbed the building stairs, and stood in front of the apartment door with the key in my hand, and Cale's sentence taking up all the available space in my head. At 2 a.m, my phone buzzed. It was Mateo. "We need to talk. This isn't over." I blocked the number with the same energy you close a window before the rain. Quick, without hesitation, without giving regret time to change your mind. The next morning, when I opened the studio, he was outside. Mateo was leaning against the red brick wall with his hands in his pockets, and his expression calibrated to look reasonable, and I saw him through the glass window before he saw me, and I thought for exactly 2 seconds about turning the key back and leaving. I didn't do it because the studio was mine, the space was mine, and 2 years of a relationship didn't give anyone the right to remove me from where I needed to be. I opened the door, went in. He knocked on the glass. I didn't open it. He stayed there for 40 minutes. I know because I looked at the clock, and then left without saying anything. That's when my phone rang. Unknown number, area code I didn't recognize. And I answered because Bex sometimes changes her number without warning, and that's one of the things I need to learn to anticipate. "Do you need help? Or can you handle it?" the voice said. Deep, low, with a slight accent I hadn't paid attention to last night, but that now seemed impossible to ignore. I stood still in the middle of the studio with the paintbrush still in my hand. "How do you have my number?" I asked. A short pause. "Cale Rienzo solves the problems he takes on, Sloan." And then he hung up, and I stood there looking at my phone with the last name echoing in my head, Rienzo, without having the slightest idea what it meant. On the other side of the city, Cale put his phone on the glass desk, and Soren, standing by the window with his arms crossed, looked at him with that expression of someone who has a formed opinion and is deciding whether to express it. "You're using Familia resources to monitor a civilian," Soren said. It wasn't a question. "I'm using my own resources," Cale answered, without taking his eyes off the papers in front of him. Soren was quiet for a moment. Then he made a note on his phone and didn't say anything else, but he made a note. Chapter 3. Pretending. Badly. Cale showed up at the studio on Tuesday at 11 in the morning with 2 coffees and no warning, and I knew in that moment the next month was going to be a lot more complicated than I'd imagined on the sidewalk outside Noir. He walked in like he knew I was going to open the door before he reached the threshold, which was exactly what happened, because I saw him through the window and went over there before consciously deciding I was going to do that. He put one of the coffees on the counter and looked around the studio with that calm attention I was already learning to recognize. It wasn't curiosity, it was assessment. His eyes traveled across the walls with the sketches taped up, the black leather chairs, the workstation with the ink bottles lined up by tone, and then came back to me with that neutral expression that gave away absolutely nothing. "You organized the ink bottles by color," he said. "They're by chromatic family," I corrected. "It's different." He picked up his own coffee and went quiet, and I understood he wasn't disagreeing. He was just registering. The rules came next, and I'd written them on the back of a paper napkin the night before because if there was anything 2 years with Mateo had taught me, it was that unwritten agreements don't exist. They only exist in the version each person decides to remember later. I pulled the napkin from my apron pocket and put it on the counter in front of Cale, who looked at it for about 2 seconds, with an expression I couldn't classify. There were 6 rules. No physical contact outside what's necessary for the performance. No showing up at the studio without warning. I could clearly cross that one out already. No making decisions for me. 1-month term, renewable only with my consent. And the last one, which I'd written and erased and rewritten 3 times. No kisses like the one at Noir. Cale read everything in silence. Then he pulled a pen from the inside pocket of his suit, black, heavy, the kind of pen people who sign important contracts use, and signed in the bottom corner of the napkin, with the same seriousness you'd sign a 10-page agreement. I stared at the signature for about 3 seconds, not knowing whether to laugh or be worried. "You just signed a napkin," I said. "You just presented me with a napkin as a contract," he answered. Seemed polite to reciprocate. The problem with Cale was that he was uncomfortably good at all of this. In the next 10 days, between the first week and the beginning of the second, he showed up at 3 dinners, an event I didn't know what it was, but for which there was a reserved table with his name at the entrance, and a casual Sunday lunch where Bex was with us and spent the next 40 minutes sending me messages under the table with the level of enthusiasm of someone who just found out they won the lottery. Cale's hand on my back when we walked into places together had the exact weight of something you shouldn't need to notice, and I noticed. The way he tilted his head slightly toward me when I spoke in loud environments, creating that closed space between the two of us that excluded the rest of the room without any visible effort. I needed to remind myself, actively and with real effort, that it was theater. Mateo was reacting the way I'd predicted, and in ways I hadn't predicted. The calls from unknown numbers stopped after I started not answering any of them. The flowers arrived on Wednesday, white roses, which was interesting information, because in 2 years of dating, he'd never sent me flowers. He showed up near the studio 2 more times, but stayed across the street, and there was something in the way he stood there watching that was different from jealousy. It was colder, more calculated, and I couldn't name what it was, so I filed that discomfort in the place where I keep things I don't know how to solve yet. The social dinner happened on Thursday of the second week, on a high floor of a midtown building with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of Manhattan that made it hard to pay attention to anything else. I didn't know what that event was. Cale had said business dinner, with the voice of someone being technically accurate but not exhaustive, and I only realized there was something different when I noticed that all the men in the room had the same posture. Not relaxed, not tense, but calibrated, like each one knew exactly how much space they occupied, and had decided that space was enough. Cale stayed by my side for the first 20 minutes, introducing me to people whose names I forgot before finishing the handshake, because there was something in the intensity of the conversations that made it hard to retain peripheral details. Then he was called to the other side of the room by an older man in a gray suit, and I was left alone with a glass of white wine and the view of Manhattan and the feeling that there was something in that environment I was failing to understand. That's when I said the thing. Soren was 2 steps to my left. He was always 2 steps from something, I was starting to notice, and I turned to him because he was the only person there whose name I knew for sure, and said, looking at the city outside, "It feels like there's an unwritten map here, and everyone knows how to read it except me." Soren was quiet for a second. Then he said, with the flat voice of someone delivering information without inflection, "You're reading it. You're just using the wrong edition." And I laughed. It wasn't a polite laugh or a nervous laugh. It was a real laugh, short, involuntary, and when I turned my head, Cale was on the other side of the room looking at me. He wasn't smiling. He was just looking, with that expression I couldn't decipher. And then the man in the gray suit said something, and Cale turned his attention back to the conversation. But there was a moment between the before and after of that, a second where his eyes were on me with a different quality than the other times, and I felt that second in my chest in a way that disturbed me. On the other side of the room, Soren looked at Cale, and then at me, and then at his own glass of water, and said absolutely nothing, but his expression was that of someone who'd just confirmed a hypothesis he'd preferred wasn't true. That night, Bex called me when I got home and went straight to it. No preamble, with the energy of someone who reserved this topic for the right moment, and the moment had arrived. "I need you to explain something to me," Bex said, "because I saw that man look at you on Sunday, and I've seen a lot of people look at you, Sloane, and he doesn't look like anyone else does." "It's an agreement," I said. "It's theater." "It is," she said, "and the theater is convincing you first." I didn't answer. I stared at the apartment ceiling for about 10 seconds, while the silence between us was the kind Bex knows how to respect when necessary, and then she said goodnight, with the voice of someone who already knows how the story ends and is just waiting for the protagonist to get there. I hung up and went to sleep. or tried to. At midnight, the apartment buzzer rang. I went to the intercom, and Mateo's voice came through the speaker, low and without the usual calibration. "You don't know who you're messing with," he said. I didn't answer. I stood there with my finger on the intercom button, and my breathing a little shorter than it should be, because Mateo's tone wasn't jealousy. It wasn't a man who'd lost something he loved. It was something else, colder, more deliberate, and I couldn't name what it was, but my body understood before I did. I went to sleep with the hallway light on. Chapter 4. When pretending stops being pretend. Cale invited me to spend the weekend at the mansion on Friday afternoon, with the voice of someone proposing something logistical and not something that was going to change the topography of the next 2 days of my life. "For safety," he said. And that word, in that tone, had a weight I still didn't know how to measure. I accepted without understanding why I accepted, which was in itself relevant information I chose to ignore at the time. The mansion was in the Upper East Side, on a tree-lined street where the sidewalks were clean, and the facades didn't compete with each other because none of them needed to prove anything. The interior was high-ceilinged, dark in the elegant sense of the word, with ceilings that made sounds behave differently, more contained, denser, and a central staircase that curved upward with the kind of structural confidence only very good materials have. I stood in the foyer for about 5 seconds just looking up. "You can touch things," Cale said beside me. "I know I can," I answered, and went to touch things. The problem with spending an entire weekend in a space with Kyle Rienzo was that the space wasn't big enough to contain the constant awareness of where he was. I knew when he entered a room before seeing him. There was a change in the quality of the air, or maybe it was just the different sound of his footsteps on the marble, but the effect was the same. My attention system reoriented without consulting me. I spent Saturday morning exploring. The library was the room that interested me most. Entire walls of shelving, books organized by size, which was an understandable choice from a visual standpoint, but deeply unsatisfying from the standpoint of any other criteria. I started reorganizing them by color before consciously thinking about what I was doing, and when I realized it, I'd already finished 2 entire shelves. Cale appeared in the study doorway. He stood there for a time that was too long to be passing through and too short to be confrontation, his eyes on me, and that expression I was starting to map. It wasn't irritation, it wasn't approval, it was something in between that I didn't have vocabulary to name yet. "That's a crime," he said. "It's aesthetic," I answered, without taking my eyes off the shelf. A second of silence. "Are you going to reorganize the entire library?" "Depends on how long I stay here," I said, and only after the sentence came out did I realize there were 2 layers in it I hadn't planned. Cale didn't answer. When I looked at the door, he'd left, but I had the clear feeling that the question remained. The theater was Saturday night, a public event, the kind that shows up in the society columns the next day with discreet photos and captions that say more than the pictures. I got ready in the room Cale had designated as mine, in a gold-framed mirror that made the light seem warmer than it was, and came down the stairs in the moss-green dress I'd brought, without being sure it was appropriate for the place. It was appropriate. Cale was in the foyer in his usual dark suit and looked at me when I came down, and the look lasted long enough for me to notice there was something different in him that night, closer to the surface, less guarded. He didn't say anything about the dress, but he opened the door for me with an attention that communicated what he hadn't verbalized. Vivienne Lacroix appeared at intermission. I saw her before she saw us, tall, blonde, in a midnight blue dress, and the posture of someone who knows she's being watched and made a decision a long time ago about what to do with that. She crossed the theater lobby toward Cale, with the naturalness of someone who has memorized routes, touched his arm with her fingers like someone reclaiming possession of something, and kissed his cheek with that kind of familiarity that also serves as a territorial declaration. "Cale," she said, with a soft, controlled French accent. "It's been a while." "Vivian," he answered. The tone was neutral in the way neutrality can be a form of coldness. Then her eyes came to me. She looked me up and down with a smile that was polite in form and cutting in content, and said, with her voice calibrated to reach my ears without seeming like it was being directed at me, "How long does it usually last? 2 months? 3? Don't worry, darling. He always comes back to what he knows." I was processing the sentence when I felt Cale's arm go around my waist, not performatively, but with a firm and deliberate pressure, and he leaned slightly, his mouth close to my temple, and said something too low for Vivian to hear. I didn't retain the words because the proximity was consuming all my processing capacity, but I felt their effect. Vivian's smile froze for exactly 1 second before she pulled everything back together with the efficiency of someone who'd practiced this recovery before. She left without saying goodbye. I was left with the heat of Cale's arm around my waist long enough to understand it was going to be hard not to think about that later. Back at the mansion, close to midnight, we ended up on the terrace, without either of us having suggested the terrace. It was the kind of thing that happens when two people are avoiding the main subject and find a neutral space where they can stand without having to decide anything. Manhattan was down below in lights, and the air was cold enough that I crossed my arms, and Cale was a step and a half to my left, leaning against the railing. "You're going to ask me about her," he said. It wasn't a question. "I was thinking about it," I admitted. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the city lights, and when he spoke there was something different in his tone. Not exactly vulnerability, but the absence of the layer he usually kept between what he felt and what he said. "She wanted what my name offers," Cale said, "but not what I was. And those are very different things." I didn't say anything. He continued without me asking. "You're the first person in years who doesn't know what my name means," he said, "and I have no idea what to do with that." The cold of the terrace suddenly seemed more distant. I was looking at his profile, the hard line of his jaw, the way he went still when he was thinking about something that mattered, and there was an attraction I was no longer managing to convince myself was just context, just situation, just the kiss at Noir, creating an illusion of familiarity. He turned his head and found me looking. The second that followed was the kind that has physical weight. I felt it in my chest, in my throat, in the acute awareness that we were too close for the space between us to be neutral. Cale's eyes dropped to my mouth for an instant, and I didn't breathe, and he didn't move, and the air between us was charged with everything neither of us had said out loud. Cale's phone buzzed. He took it from his pocket without hurry, looked at the screen, and the expression that had been on the surface of his face went back to where it usually stayed, deeper, more guarded. He answered, listened, and when he hung up, there was something new in the dark eyes. It wasn't alarm. It was something colder and older than alarm. "What is it?" I asked. Cale looked at me for 2 seconds before answering. "Mateo Varga was seen monitoring your apartment," he said, "with 2 armed men." The cold of the terrace came back all at once. Chapter 5. Second Impact. The Fall. I went back to my apartment Monday morning because I had a real deadline, a real project, and a client waiting for sketches by Wednesday, and because staying at Cale's mansion with the terrace scene still alive in my head wasn't a condition favorable to concentration. I told him I needed to work in my own space, with my own references, and without the weight of that high ceiling reorganizing my thoughts. He didn't argue, just looked at me for a second with that calm attention, and said it was fine, and it was too fine for me not to be suspicious. The apartment was the way I'd left it, a little chaotic, with sketches on the table, and 2 coffee cups forgotten on the kitchen counter, and I took a deep breath when I walked in, because there was something about the smell of my own space that organized what the rest of the world was trying to disorganize. Bex arrived 40 minutes later with croissants and the energy of someone who's had questions backed up since Friday and has reached the limit of backing up. We spent the morning working, her on the laptop, me at the drawing table. And it was a good morning, the silent and productive kind that only happens with people who don't need to fill the silence. What I didn't know, while finishing the second sketch with the fine-tip marker, was that 2 of Cale's men were positioned downstairs, one in the building lobby, disguised as a bicycle delivery guy, and another in a car parked on the street with a direct view of the main entrance. Soren had set this up without telling me, and Cale had approved it without telling me, and I would have refused if I'd known, which was probably why no one told me. At 3 in the afternoon, I was hungry, and the fridge had nothing useful, so I grabbed my key and went down through the back service door. I always used that exit when I was in a hurry. It was faster to the side street and avoided the main hallway when there were deliveries. It was 2 minutes from the apartment to the alley sidewalk, and 3 more blocks to the corner market. What I didn't know was that the back door was outside the field of view of Cale's 2 men, and that the man from 4B, who I'd crossed paths with a few times in the hallway and who always looked away too quickly to be just shyness, had been noting my routine for weeks and passing the information to Mateo with the precision of someone being paid for it. Mateo was half a block from the market. He appeared from the side as if he were passing by chance, but nothing in the way he moved was chance. There was precision in it, the kind that comes from having waited for the right window for days. His hands were in his coat pockets, and his face had that calibrated expression I'd seen at the VIP bathroom door at Noir, on the sidewalk after the club, in front of the studio. Always calculated, always 1 step ahead of the emotion he pretended to be feeling. "Sloan," he said, as if we were at a scheduled meeting. I stopped. "Mateo, we have nothing to talk about. You're making a mistake," he said, and took a step toward me. "You don't know who this man is, what he represents, what you're getting involved with." "I'm getting involved with my own life," I said, and tried to walk past him. He grabbed my arm. Mateo's hand closed around my forearm with a pressure that wasn't jealousy. It was control, the kind that doesn't ask and doesn't negotiate. He pulled me back close to him, and his other hand went to my face, and I understood in 1 second what he intended to do, and pulled away hard before he got there, using my elbow on his chest the way Bex taught me on a Saturday afternoon when we thought it was just exercise, and it was being much more useful than it seemed at the time. Mateo stepped back, more from surprise than pain, and his expression closed in a way that was more dangerous than open anger. It was cold. It was calculated. It was the face of someone making a plan revision in real time. Then Cale was there. He didn't run. That was the first thing I noticed, and that stayed with me. He walked toward Matteo with measured steps and a calm that was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen in a human being in motion. There was no hurry in him, no alarm. There was just that specific serenity of someone who knows exactly what they're doing and doesn't need speed to prove it. Two men emerged from the sides of the street, silent and positioned with precision that only comes from prior instruction. Matteo saw them and stood still. Cale stopped 1 meter from Matteo and looked at him. Just looked, without speaking, without gesturing, without doing anything except existing in that space with all the presence the Rienzo name carried, and which I was still understanding the real weight of. Matteo looked at Cale with a hatred that wasn't impulsive. It was old, it was specific, and it was calculated. The kind of hatred someone keeps because they know they'll need it later. And then he said, his voice low and precise, "You're on territory that isn't yours, Rienzo." He knew the last name, said it with the recognition of someone who knows that name from a context that wasn't the same as mine, and I was left with that sitting in the middle of my chest, because there was information there about Matteo that didn't yet fit into any structure I had for organizing what I knew about him. Cale didn't answer. The two men approached, and Matteo left with them without resisting, which, I realized later, was more frightening than if he had resisted, because it meant he was already calculating the next step. At the mansion, I demanded explanations. Cale gave me part of the truth with the precision of someone who knows exactly how much to reveal, so the other person understands enough without panicking. He had real enemies. Matteo was connected to dangerous people, the kind who used armed men to monitor apartments and informants inside residential buildings. I wasn't safe alone without an escort. He didn't say the word Mafia. I didn't ask directly, because there was a part of me that still didn't want the answer to be real. What I retained was this. Matteo knew who Cale was. Cale knew who Matteo was. And neither of them had told me this when there was an opportunity to do so, which made me the only person in the entire triangle operating with incomplete information. I went to my room without saying anything else, and stood staring at the wall long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable. In that interval, Soren knocked on the bedroom door with the expression of someone who has bad information, and has already assessed that there's no good time to deliver it. "Matteo disappeared," he said, direct. The men who escorted him were found 2 blocks away, disarmed. Someone was waiting with enough structure to extract him in less than 10 minutes. A pause. He had external support we didn't map. My mistake. Soren rarely admitted mistakes. The fact that he admitted this one told me more about the seriousness of the situation than any operational detail he could have added. That's when my phone buzzed with a mention alert notification. A society column I followed for reasons I couldn't explain now. The photo was of me, leaving through the main entrance of the mansion one morning the previous week, with my hair still wet and Cale's coat on my shoulders because mine was in the room. The caption said, with venomous elegance, that Mr. Rienzo appeared to be enjoying a temporary novelty of less conventional origin. Vivian Lacroix had liked the post 30 seconds after it went live. I packed my bag. It wasn't an emotional decision. It was logical. I was a tattoo artist from the Lower East Side who'd asked a stranger to pretend he knew her for 10 seconds, and that had grown into something I hadn't anticipated, and that was now putting me on society column pages with captions about my origin. I hadn't signed up for this. That wasn't the agreement. I had my bag open on the bed when Cale knocked on the door. I opened it. He looked at the bag, then at me, and there was no surprise on his face. There was something more tired, more real than the expression he usually brought to public spaces. "You're not going anywhere until I know you're safe," he said. "You don't give me orders," I answered. He was quiet for a second, and then he said, his voice a tone lower than usual, without the armor that was normally in it, "No, but I care about you." I stood looking at him for 3 seconds in which the hallway silence had the weight of everything neither of us had named yet, and the open bag on the bed behind me suddenly seemed like a statement I wasn't sure I wanted to make. "I know it was Vivian," he said, before I could answer anything, "and I'm going to handle it." "You don't need to handle anything for me," I said. "I'm not a problem that needs solving." "I'm not treating you like a problem," Cale answered, and there was something in the tone that was different from the other times he'd spoken to me, without the layer of control, without the calculated distance. It was just the sentence, direct and without ornament. "I'm treating you like someone who matters." I didn't know what to do with that, so I did nothing. Stood in the doorway with my hand still on the handle and his gaze on me, and the silence between us was the kind that asks for an answer, but accepts silence back as a provisional response. Are you going to confront her? I asked finally. I'm already going, he said, and left. I didn't go downstairs. I stayed in the room with the bag open on the bed and didn't close it, but also didn't unpack it. Stayed in that middle ground. That's where you stay when you're angry at a situation, but have already started to suspect that leaving doesn't solve the situation. It just removes you from it. I heard Cale leave through the front entrance 40 minutes later, heard the car drive away. And then I went to the bedroom window and stood looking at the tree-lined Upper East Side street with the suitcase still open behind me and didn't close it. Cale came back an hour later. I was in the kitchen making tea because it was the only activity that seemed neutral enough for my state of mind. And I heard his footsteps in the marble hallway before he appeared in the doorway. It's handled, he said. What did you say to her? I asked. He went to the counter, grabbed a glass, opened the fridge. I said that any move against you has consequences she doesn't want to know about. A pause, and that she no longer has space in this life, with or without you in it. I stopped with the cup in my hand. You said that? I did, he answered, with the same serenity he said everything with, as if that were simply a fact, and not a statement that shifted the ground a little under my feet. Vivian was leaving the picture by her own will, or by understanding that the cost of continuing was too high. Either way, she wasn't coming back. And Cale had chosen to say this before knowing whether I was going to unpack the bag or zip it up and leave. That was information too. I put the cup on the counter and looked at him for a second. Thank you, I said, for lack of something more precise. He looked back at me, with that look that stayed on the surface when he wasn't trying to keep it deeper, and said nothing. But there was in his silence the same quality as the silence on the terrace the night before. Charged, intentional, with something neither of us was naming, but both were feeling on the same frequency. Then Soren's phone rang from the other room, and Soren appeared in the kitchen doorway with the expression of someone who has bad information and is assessing the best time to deliver it. The best time was now. Apparently. Mateo disappeared, Soren said, looking at Cale. The escorts were found disarmed 2 blocks away. He had external support waiting. It was fast. Cale was quiet. Put his glass on the counter with deliberate care, without hurry, and I recognized that gesture. It was what he did when he was processing something with all the weight the something deserved. How long since he left the street? Cale asked. Less than 10 minutes, Soren answered. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. This one had texture, had repressed urgency. I already knew what that meant. Soren had told me in the room. With the same flat voice he delivered anything that couldn't wait. But hearing Cale receive the information was different from having received it first. There was something in the way he went still, with that cold concentration turned inward, that made the danger more real than any operational detail. I looked at him. He was looking back at me with that expression I now knew how to read as care. Not paternalistic protection, but real care. The kind that comes from wanting someone to be okay, and understanding that wanting has practical consequences. You stay here tonight, he said. It wasn't an order. It was the logical conclusion of an equation he'd done, and that I, if I was honest, had reached the same result. I didn't unpack my bag that night, but I didn't close it either. Chapter 6. Emotional payoff. I stayed. I didn't make a formal decision about it. The suitcase remained open on the bed, the zipper remained unzipped, and I remained at the mansion with the silent logic of someone who knows that leaving at that moment would be an escape disguised as a choice. There was a difference between the two things, and I'd learned the hard way that confusing one with the other didn't end well. Dinner was in the kitchen, with the cutting board bearing old marks and the warmer light. It was the only room in the mansion that seemed to have been truly used. And Cale, standing at the counter with his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, seemed like a different version of himself, still imposing, still with that presence that reorganized any space he entered, but with one less layer between the exterior and what was underneath. Soren had left after delivering the information about Mateo. It was just the two of us, and the mansion's silence, which at night had a different quality, deeper, more present, as if the rooms became larger when there was nothing left to fill the space besides us. He made pasta. I sat on the high counter stool with a glass of wine and watched him, and there was something so unexpectedly domestic about it that I needed a moment to adjust the image to the man I'd seen look at Mateo on that street with the calm of someone who makes men disappear. You actually know how to cook, I said. It wasn't a question. My mother didn't tolerate men who didn't know how, he answered, without taking his eyes off the pan. Italian? I asked. Neapolitan, he said, and there was something in his tone that was almost tenderness. The contained version, the only version Cale Rienzo seemed to operate in. She would have reorganized the books by color too, probably would have gone further than you did. I laughed. and the sound came out lighter than I expected for the state I was in, and Cale turned his head slightly in my direction, with that corner of a smile that appeared rarely and always caught me off guard. We ate without formality, with our plates on the counter instead of the table, and the conversation was the kind that starts slowly and then doesn't stop. Not because someone is trying to keep it going, but because both sides have things they rarely say out loud, and somehow the environment created an opening that wasn't there before. He told me about Nico without me asking directly, said the name with the naturalness of someone mentioning someone who's always present, even when not visible. The younger brother, 22 when he died, with the kind of energy that took up twice the space his body had, died in an ambush 5 years ago, in the type of territorial conflict I still didn't fully understand. But that had left a mark on Cale that wasn't simple grief. It was guilt, the kind that stays when you think you should have predicted it, that you should have protected him, that the job of an older brother is exactly that, and you failed at it. You never found out who ordered it, I said. It wasn't a question. It was a reading of what he hadn't said explicitly, but that was present in every word he'd chosen. Never, he confirmed, and went quiet with that specific silence of someone who's carried an unanswered question, long enough for it to become part of the structure of who he was. I looked at my wine glass for a moment, and then I said the thing I rarely said, because there was rarely context that made saying it necessary. My father left when I was 12, I said. He didn't die, he left, which is in a way more complicated because there's no clean grief. Just the slow version of understanding that it wasn't about you, and at the same time feeling like it was about you for years. Cale looked at me, with the total attention he had for things that mattered, without the movement of someone formulating a response while listening, just listening. That's why I stayed with Mateo so long, I continued, and the words came out without much difficulty because there was something in that kitchen that night that made honesty easier than usual. I confused stability with love, thought I'd found someone who stayed, got the whole criteria wrong. The silence that followed was the kind that brings people closer, not through any intentional action, but because two people who've said true things at the same time occupy a different space together than they occupied before. He stood up to get more wine, and I went with him without consciously realizing I was doing it, got up from the stool and went to the counter where he was with the bottle, and when he turned, we were side by side with less distance between us than had been planned by either of us. He didn't step back, neither did I. We stayed like that for a second in which the kitchen became very quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't absence of sound, but presence of something that doesn't need sound. Cale's gaze was on me with that surface quality I'd learned to recognize as the moment when he stopped keeping what he was feeling deeper than necessary. He lowered his head slightly, slowly, in a way that leaves space for the other person to choose what they want to do with what's happening. His eyes dropped to my mouth and came back up, and I wasn't breathing correctly, and he was too close for me to think about anything else besides the heat between us and the acute awareness that this was real. Not theater, not an agreement, not the 10 seconds at Noir. Real. And then he kissed me, different from the club. At Noir there was urgency. There was context. There was the hand on my face with the intention of convincing someone of something. Here there was just intention, for me, with nothing else. Slower, deeper, with his hand finding the side of my face the same way but without the rush, and the other on the counter behind me, and the heat of his body close enough that I could feel it without there being touch beyond that. It was the kind of kiss that doesn't need anything else to be complete, and that at the same time makes you want more in a way that's hard to separate from wanting in general. I had my hand on his suit jacket, didn't remember putting it there, but it was, and he was leaning toward me with all that attention concentrated on me, and I was losing the thread of any structured thought when the kitchen door opened. Soren walked in without knocking, took 2 steps, processed what he was seeing, and backed out with an efficiency that would have been admirable in any other context. His heel met the doorframe with a dull thud, and he muttered something in Italian I didn't understand, but that from the tone wasn't a blessing. Cale and I stepped apart. There was a second where neither of us said anything, and then I laughed. A real laugh, involuntary, the kind that comes out when your body decides the situation is simultaneously absurd and too good not to acknowledge, and Cale smiled. Not the discreet corner from other times, a real smile that changed his entire face in a way I realized, in that moment I'd never seen before, and that stayed with me in a way I knew was going to take a while to fade. "Urgent information," Soren said from the hallway, with the flat voice of someone pretending the last 30 seconds didn't happen. Cale didn't take his eyes off me for one more second, before turning toward the hallway. There was in his gaze, in that last second, something that was both a promise and a question, and that I didn't know how to answer yet, but kept. Soren entered again, this time with his dignity intact and a tablet in his hand. He put the device on the counter and pointed at the screen with the objectivity of someone who has a function and will fulfill it regardless of what he just interrupted. The screen showed a map of Manhattan's South Port with 3 points marked in red, and a name I recognized immediately, because I'd spent 2 years hearing that name associated with business meetings and work trips, and the entire carefully constructed facade of a life that didn't exist. Varga, Soren said, looking at Kale. Movement at the South Port in the last 6 hours. 3 containers with inconsistent registration. And Matteo coordinating personally, which means what he's planning isn't reaction, it's operation. Kale looked at the map for a few seconds with that cold concentration I'd seen before, but that now had a different weight, because I knew more than I knew before about what was underneath it. He's using the port as a pressure point, Kale said. Not to me, to Soren, but he looked at me next, with that attention he reserved for when he wanted me to understand something, which means what comes next won't be on the street. I understood enough to know that was worse. Chapter 7, The Hidden Truth. On Wednesday morning, Kale asked me to come to his office, not with that voice of invitation, with the voice of someone who'd made a decision overnight and woke up with it intact, and with the intention to act on it before the moment passed. I followed him down the marble hallway to the heavy dark oak door. He closed it behind both of us, and then he stood in the middle of the room looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Not the usual calm, but something closer to the surface, more exposed. "I'm not just an executive, Sloan," he said. I stayed quiet and waited. I'd learned, in the last few weeks, that interrupting Kyle Rienzo, when he was about to say something important, was the most efficient way not to hear what he needed to say. He told me everything. The Familia Rienzo, what it was, what it meant in New York and beyond, what he commanded, how he commanded it, what that name carried in power and weight and real danger, the kind that wasn't a metaphor, the kind that had concrete consequences for flesh and blood people. He spoke with the precision of someone who'd chosen each word before opening his mouth, without softening what couldn't be softened, and without dramatizing what didn't need drama to be serious. I listened in silence. I didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't do any of the things I imagined I would in the face of a revelation this big. I went very quiet, and my quiet, as I'd once told him, was worse than any scream. When he finished, I asked for space. He respected it, opened the office door and stood there, and I walked past him without touching him, and went to the bedroom and closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed staring at the floor for a time I couldn't measure. Soren entered the room 2 hours later, with a brief knock on the door that was more warning than request for permission, and sat in the chair near the window, with the tablet in his lap, and the expression of someone who has information that can't wait any longer, regardless of the emotional state of who's going to receive it. "I need to tell you something," he said, and there was a different quality in Soren's tone than usual, not colder, but more careful. "Matteo Varga isn't just a lieutenant in the rival Familia. He was the one who passed Nico's coordinates for the ambush 5 years ago. He didn't order it, but he delivered it." I stared at Soren for 3 seconds while the sentence settled. "You're sure about this?" "I am," he said, "and Kale doesn't know yet. I'm going to tell him now." Soren left, and I was left with the weight of that, with the image of Kale that morning, talking about Nico with that voice that tried to be neutral and couldn't quite manage it, and with the entire equation reorganizing itself into a much darker structure than I'd had the conditions to imagine. I needed air. That mansion, which had started to seem familiar in recent days, suddenly had ceilings that were too high, and hallways that were too long, and I convinced myself I was safe. Matteo had been removed from the street by Kale before I arrived. The port was another front, and I was inside the only place in Manhattan where there were men paid to ensure nothing happened to me. I convinced myself, which is different from being right. I went down the side staircase, and out through the garden door, without realizing there had been eyes on that space from the moment the door closed behind me. The garden was silent and cold, with the October light making long shadows between the trees lined along the wall. I went to the stone bench in the farthest corner and sat with my elbows on my knees and my head slightly down, breathing the outside air and trying to organize my thoughts into a sequence that had some coherence. I didn't hear the footsteps. The first sign was a hand that closed around my arm with a force that left no room for negotiation, and then there was a second man on the other side, and before I could react with anything useful, I was being led to the side of the mansion, with the speed and silence of someone who'd executed this type of movement before and knew the time window was short. I screamed. Someone covered my mouth. And then there was a car, and a door, and the mansion garden was left behind. The warehouse was at the south port, and it smelled of salt water and rusted metal, and the kind of silence that only exists in places that weren't made for people to stay very long. They left me in a metal chair in the center of the space with my wrists tied behind me, and two men positioned at the extremities, and Matteo stood in front of me with his hands in his coat pockets, and that calibrated expression I'd finally decoded. It wasn't anger, it was calculation. "Rienzo will trade you for withdrawal from the south port," Matteo said, with the voice of someone announcing a fact. "It's simple. You've known me for 2 years, I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "You think I'm the kind of currency that works in this transaction? I think he won't leave you here," Matteo answered, and there was something in his tone that was almost admiration, the cynical version of it, that recognizes the feeling in another without sharing it, which already tells me more about him than I needed to know. We were silent for a moment, and then Matteo said, his voice a little lower, with the quality of someone delivering something they've been keeping for a while. "I know Soren found out what I did. With Nico." He didn't look away. "I thought that would destroy Rienzo. Got the calculation wrong." I looked at him for 2 seconds. "You gave up his brother." "I gave up a location," he said, as if there were a difference. "It's business, Sloane. It always was. You would never understand." "I understand enough," I said. Cale arrived in less than 2 hours. I knew before seeing him because the two men at the warehouse extremities changed posture at the same time, with that involuntary rigidity of someone recognizing a threat before consciously processing it. And then the side door opened and he walked in with Soren and 4 men positioned with the precision of an operation that had been assembled in record time and executed without improvisation. He walked to the center of the warehouse without hurry. His eyes went to me first, a quick scan, top to bottom, assessing, and only then went to Matteo. And there was, in that look, now that I knew what Soren had revealed, a layer I hadn't seen before. It wasn't just the look of a man of power facing an enemy, it was the look of a brother. Matteo understood the calculation had failed when Cale's men closed the space around him. He didn't step back, had too much pride to step back, but his expression closed with the speed of someone moving from plan A to an emergency version that didn't exist yet. "You know what I did," Matteo said, looking at Cale, "and you still came personally. That's weakness." "No," Cale answered, with a voice lower than I'd ever heard. And colder. "It's the only thing you deserved from me." Matteo was captured by Cale's men, without physical resistance. There was enough clarity in the numbers that resisting would only add consequences. And then, there was just me and Cale in the center of the warehouse, with the smell of salt water, and the silence slowly returning. He crossed the space between us, and untied my wrists with an attention that was both efficient and careful, his fingers checking the circulation before undoing the knot, his hand remaining a second after the binding had been undone, as if he needed to confirm everything was okay before moving on. I didn't say anything. Neither did he. In the car back to the mansion, the city passed by the windows in silence, and Cale kept looking forward for a long time. Then, without turning his head, he placed his hand over mine, open, without pressure, just present. I left it there, and he said, his eyes still on the street, "I know you need to decide if you can stay in this life, but I need you to know, what I feel for you isn't part of any plan." I looked at his hand over mine and said nothing, because there was nothing that would fit in that moment that would be enough. But I didn't pull my hand away either. Chapter 8. The Climax and Resolution. I woke up Friday morning with the sun coming through the gap in the curtains and a strange clarity in my head, the kind that comes after nights when your body decides it's processed enough, and what comes next needs to be awake. My wrist still had the faint mark from the warehouse rope. Not painful, just present. Like a reminder I hadn't asked for, but that was fulfilling the function of making everything concrete, in a way my head was trying to soften. I lay there looking at the mansion bedroom ceiling for a time I didn't measure. And I thought about Cale, who was the opposite of everything I'd thought I wanted. Dangerous, with an entire world beneath the dark suit that I hadn't anticipated and that had real consequences, and who at the same time was the most honest person I'd met in a long time. Not in the sense of telling everything from the start, because he hadn't done that, but in the sense of not pretending to be something else, of looking at me like I was the most important thing in the room and not pretending I wasn't. That was, I realized looking at the ceiling, much more than I'd had before. Bex arrived at 10 in the morning with 2 coffees, and the controlled energy of someone who'd received a serious phone call and was making the conscious effort not to turn it into panic. Cale had sent for her. I learned this from her, not from him. which was information about him that I filed away with the others. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened to me. Everything. The warehouse, the tied wrists, Mateo with that voice of someone announcing a transaction, Cale arriving without hurry with that calm that was the most terrifying and at the same time the safest thing I'd ever experienced. The familiar revelation, his hand over mine in the car. Bex listened without interrupting, which in itself was an indication she'd understood the gravity, because Bex without interruption was Bex in real listening mode. When I finished, she was quiet for about 10 seconds, the silence of someone organizing what they're going to say before saying it. "You're afraid to stay," she said finally. "Or afraid of liking it this much?" I didn't answer, but the answer was in the pause. Too long to be the first option, which I would have dismissed faster if it were true. "It's the second one," Beck said without cruelty, with the kind of precision that only comes from knowing someone long enough to read what they don't verbalize. "And you know the second one isn't a reason to leave. It's a reason to stay with more attention." She stayed another hour, then she left with the hug I needed, and without any of the questions I wasn't ready to answer, and I was left with the mansion's silence and the decision that had already been made before I realized I was making it. On the other side of the mansion, Cale was in the office trying to work. Soren had passed by twice with documents that needed attention, and both times Cale had looked at the papers with the concentration of someone reading but retaining nothing, which was, for that specific man, an anomaly Soren had registered in silence. The third time he passed the door, Soren stopped in the doorway. "In many years," Soren said, "I've never seen you unable to focus." Cale raised his eyes from the papers, looked at Soren for a second with the expression of someone who wasn't going to pretend the observation was inaccurate. "In many years," Cale answered. "I've never had a reason." Soren didn't comment, left with his usual efficiency, but there was something in the angle of his shoulder that was almost satisfaction. The contained version, the only version Soren Vale operated in. In the early afternoon, Soren knocked on the office door with the tablet in his hand, and the expression of someone who has a confirmation. Not news, but the closing of something that had been open for a long time. Cale raised his eyes from the papers. "Mateo has been prosecuted," Soren said. "The dossier held. There's no loophole." Cale was quiet for a moment. Then he did something Soren, in all the years they'd worked together, hadn't seen. He put the pen on the desk with deliberate care, like someone setting down something heavy in a safe place, and stared at it. "And the Vargas?" he asked, with the voice he used when he was being precise, because precision was the only alternative to what he was feeling. Without operational leadership and with the public exposure, they don't have a position to maintain the territory. Soren paused. "The European families have already signaled willingness to mediate. It's the end of them in New York." Cale didn't answer, kept looking at the pen on the desk for a time. Soren knew how to measure, the kind of silence that doesn't ask for a response, just presence, and then said, his voice low and without the layer of control that was normally in it, "Nico was 22. He was," Soren said. Just that. It was enough. Cale stood up, went to the window, and stood there looking at the tree-lined Upper East Side street, with his arms crossed, and that specific stillness of someone processing something with all the weight it deserved. Soren stayed where he was, without leaving, without saying anything. The presence of someone who understands that some things don't need words, just a witness. After a while, Cale went back to the desk, picked up the pen, and worked. It wasn't the kind of closure that appears in movies, but it was the only one that existed. Silent, permanent, and in a way heavier than anything else could have been. Mateo was in a cell. The Vargas no longer existed as a force in New York. The man from 4B was identified and removed from the building Thursday morning. Soren told me with the objectivity he told everything. Name, function, how long he'd been there. I sat with that for a moment, weeks crossing paths with him in the hallway, the morning coffee cups, the door opening and closing at the right time. I thought I knew what was around me. I'd gotten the criteria wrong again, but this time I already knew how not to repeat it. And the man who delivered the coordinates for an ambush 5 years ago had answered for it with the precision Kyle Rienzo reserved for things that truly mattered. I learned all of this later, from Soren. With the objectivity he told everything, but I kept the image he described to me. Cale standing at the window, the pen set down on the desk, and the silence of the closed office, because there was something in it I understood, without needing explanation. Some things weigh differently when they finally find a place to land. I found him in the office in the early afternoon. I knocked on the door, he said to come in, and when I opened it, he was standing near the window with his arms crossed and his eyes on the street outside. And when he turned and saw me, the expression that appeared on his face was the first time I'd seen Kale Rienzo with something close to insecurity. Slight, contained, but present. I walked in and closed the door behind me. We looked at each other for a second that had the weight of everything that had happened in recent weeks. Noir, the signed napkin, the terrace, the kitchen, the warehouse, his hand over mine in the car, and then I spoke before the silence became too big for any words to fit. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not afraid of what you are," I said, "but I'm more afraid of leaving than of staying." He was quiet for a second, and then he crossed the space between us. He didn't kiss me, which was, I discovered, more disconcerting than if he had. He stood in front of me, too close for the space between us to be neutral, and looked at me with all that attention concentrated on me, and there was something on his face I hadn't seen before. Not the usual calm, not the layer of control, but Cale completely, without armor. "I know," he said, his voice low and direct, "and I'm not going to waste this." In the hallway afterward, he stood facing me with me leaning lightly against the wall, and both of us too close to be innocent. His hand was beside my face, on the doorframe, without touching me, and there was in all that proximity an intention that was more intense than any touch would have been. I understood what he was doing, deciding that the next time would be the right way, and that left me more disconcerted than anything he could have done. He took a step back, looked at me one more time with that look I already knew how to keep, and walked away down the hallway without hurry, as if he knew I was going to stay where I was for a while after he left. He knew, and I did stay. Chapter 9. The dinner that changed the name of things. The restaurant was empty. Not closed. Empty. With the tables set, and the lights on, and a discreet sommelier at the entrance who greeted me by name as if I were expected, which I was, and as if this were normal, which it wasn't. Cale had reserved the entire space, and when I walked in and saw the dining room with no one else besides him standing next to the table in the back, the first thing I thought was that this man didn't do anything halfway. He saw me cross the room before I reached him, stood where he was, without coming to meet me, and looked at me with that concentrated attention I already knew how to recognize, and that this time had no attempt to keep it deeper. I was wearing the simple black dress I'd brought without being sure it was appropriate, and from the way he looked at me as I walked, it was appropriate. He didn't say anything about the dress, pulled out the chair, waited for me to sit, and then went to his place with the naturalness of someone who does this because they want to, not because they know it's expected. The conversation was different from other nights, lighter, more honest, with the space that only exists when both sides have stopped watching each other enough to simply be. He told me things about Naples, about summers at his grandmother's house with Nico, about how he'd learned to cook, because the alternative was depending on his own grandmother, who cooked with passion and no measurable talent. I laughed in a way I hadn't planned, and he smiled, the real smile, the one that changed his entire face. I said things too, about the studio, about the first client I'd tattooed alone after opening my own space, about how I'd spent 2 hours after he left convinced I'd ruined that man's arm forever, and he'd come back 3 months later, asking for the continuation. Cale listened with that attention that still surprised me, not the attention of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but of someone keeping what they're hearing. In the middle of dinner, he set down his glass and looked at me in a way I'd already learned to identify as the precursor to something important. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and it's not about pretending." I waited. "Be my girlfriend," Cale said, his voice direct and without ornament. The real way. No contract, no list of conditions, no deadline. A small pause. And then, "I know what I am and what my life is, but I also know I can't imagine this life without you in it anymore." The empty dining room became very quiet. I looked at him for a time that was long enough for me to reach my own conclusion at my own pace. Not hesitation, just the way I process things that truly matter, which is slowly and from the inside, before any words. "You're going to have to accept that I reorganize things by color," I said finally. He didn't smile immediately, looked at me for a second with that deep look, and then said, "I already had the library renovated." I laughed. He smiled. And it was done, in the simple and inevitable way things are when they stop trying to be something else. He stood up, came to me, leaned his face close to mine for a second that lasted too long, and kissed me in the middle of the empty dining room with the calm of someone who has an entire audience watching, and wouldn't change anything because of it. In the car back, Cale's fingers found mine between the 2 seats, without announcement, without gesture, just the simple gesture of someone who decides they don't want space where there doesn't need to be any. I left my hand there and looked at the city passing by the window with that silence between us that was different from all previous silences. Lighter, more whole. At the mansion, he took me to the upstairs hallway and stopped in front of my room. Looked at me. "You can stay in your room," he said. And the way he said it made it clear it was a choice being offered, not a direction being given. I looked at him for a second, then I took a step toward his room. He followed me. The door closed. What happened inside that room starts before the door closes. It starts in the hallway, in the way he put his hand on my waist when we reached the door frame, slowly, as if learning the measure of the gesture. It starts in the way he looked at me before anything else, with an attention that made it impossible to think about anything besides that specific space and that specific moment. Inside the room, the light was low, and Manhattan was out there through the window in distant points of white and orange light, and there was between us the heat of weeks of proximity that had never found a place to land completely. When he put his hands on my face, the same way as at Noir, but with a completely different intention, without an audience, without performance, just us, I understood this was the opposite of pretending. It was the most real thing that had happened in a long time. I won't describe what happened next because some things belong only to the space where they happen. But I'll say he was careful in the way people are when something truly matters, attentive, present, unhurried, and that there was a moment when he said my name with a voice I'd never heard in him before, low and without any armor, and that I kept that moment in a place it won't leave anytime soon. At dawn, I woke up before him. The mansion was silent, and the light from New York came through the gap in the curtains in thin streaks, and Cale was sleeping beside me with a quality of rest I'd never seen in him awake, without posture, without guard, without the weight of everything he carried when he was standing in the world. He was just a man, and it was, I discovered looking at him in that light, one of the most beautiful things I'd seen. He opened his eyes, found me looking and didn't say anything for a moment, just looked back at me with that attention he had for things that mattered. "Good morning," I said, my voice a little awkward. "It is," he answered, and smiled. At 7 a.m, I texted Bex. "So," she responded in seconds. "So? Sloan Mercer. I need details now." On the other side of the mansion, Soren was passing through the hallway when he heard Cale humming something in Italian in the bathroom. He stopped, looked at the closed door for 2 seconds, left without saying anything, with the smallest smile of his entire life. Chapter 10. Living Here. Life started to fall into place in a way I hadn't planned, and that, I discovered, was better than anything I had planned. During the day I went to the studio, by car, with one of Cale's security men who drove in silence and never commented on my irregular schedule, worked with clients, created sketches, closed up the space. At night I came back to the mansion. It was that simple, and there was in that simplicity a quality I was learning to recognize as real stability, not the manufactured version I'd confused with love before, but the kind that comes from a place that truly exists. The suitcase stayed open on my bedroom bed for 2 days after dinner. On the third day, Cale passed by the bedroom door, looked at it, and said nothing. On the third night, while I was in the kitchen, he appeared in the doorway with his glass of whiskey and the expression of someone who'd reached a conclusion and was ready to deliver it. "Move in here," he said, not as an order, as a request. "I don't want you to have packed bags on my floor anymore." I looked at him for a time that was enough for him to get slightly tense, which was, in itself, satisfying to observe. "You know the studio is on the other side of the city," I said. "I know," he answered, "and that I wake up at 6 a.m. "I know, and that I'm going to reorganize the entire library. The renovation's already been approved." I looked at him for one more second. He'd planned for every objection with the same precision he planned anything else that mattered to him, and there was something in that was the most irresistible version of care I'd found. "All right," I said. "But the room is mine." "It was mine first," he answered, with the corner of a smile. "Now it's ours." I called Bex. She screamed so loud that Cale, on the other side of the room, heard it clearly, and drank his whiskey without any effort to hide the smile. We scheduled the following weekend to pack up the Lower East Side apartment. That night, the two of us were on the mansion terrace with all of New York down below. I was leaning against him, his arms around me, and we stayed like that for a while, without either of us needing to fill the silence with anything. "You know all of this started with a kiss I asked a stranger for," I said finally. He was quiet for a second. His mouth was close to my temple when he answered, his voice low and without any armor. "I know." A pause. "Good decision." I laughed. He pulled me a little closer, and New York continued down below, indifferent and illuminated, knowing nothing. Someone was selling Cale Rienzo. Not numbers, not territories, something much worse. They were selling his cracks, the way he breathed, what distracted him, the exact place where he lowered his guard when he thought he was safe. The weapon chosen to use all of this had an angel's face and a name, Victoria Laurent. Cale didn't see it. The man who saw betrayal in every shadow was blind. But Sloan saw everything, and what she found when she pulled the thread was worse than anything the two of them were prepared to face. Because in this world, the price for saving a king was usually the sacrifice of the queen.